Gaze now upon this image, an artifact from a bygone era, specifically the year 1903. It is a sepia-toned photograph, its edges softened by the passage of more than a century, its surface bearing the faint marks of time. At first glance, it appears to be a perfectly ordinary family portrait, a snapshot of life from a world long past. But look closer. Allow your eyes to truly linger on its details. For this is not just any old photo. This is an enigma, a historical puzzle that has confounded experts and stirred unease in all who have dared to scrutinize its unsettling depths. There is something in the background, a detail so profoundly out of place, so jarringly anachronistic, that it defies all logical explanation. The photograph was not discovered in some grand archive or meticulously preserved collection. Its journey into the modern world was far more humble, far more accidental. It emerged from the forgotten corners of an old attic, perhaps in a dusty, sun-drenched house in Salem, Massachusetts, a town already steeped in its own dark history. Or perhaps from a battered cardboard box unearthed at a rural flea market in the quiet, rolling hills of Pennsylvania. Wherever it was found, its initial discovery likely sparked little more than a fleeting curiosity, a momentary appreciation for a glimpse into the past. Yet for the individual who eventually held it, a subtle disquiet began to percolate beneath the surface of that initial observation. The central subject of the photograph is a young child, no older than 5 or 6 years old. The child sits stiffly on a simple wooden chair, hands clasped, perhaps a little too tightly in their lap. The face, partially obscured by the typical softness of early photography, suggests a slight discomfort, a common expression for children enduring the lengthy exposure times required for portraits in that era. Their clothing, a modest ensemble of the period, speaks of a quiet, perhaps provincial, existence. The setting is equally unremarkable, a plain indoor space, possibly a parlor or a drawing room, its sparse furnishings hinting at practicality over opulence. A potted plant, a framed picture on the wall, perhaps a faint pattern on wallpaper. These are the mundane elements that comprise the scene. But then, your gaze inevitably drifts, drawn by an invisible thread, past the child, past the chair, to the space directly behind them. And there it is. The anomaly. It's not immediately obvious, not a glaring, impossible object that screams its presence. No, it's far more insidious, far more unsettling. It manifests as a distortion, a shadow that seems to possess an unnatural depth, a presence that warps the fabric of the image itself. It's something that looks utterly out of place, not merely in the context of a turn-of-the-century photograph, but in the very reality it purports to capture. It's a smudge that isn't a smudge, a blur that isn't a blur, a form that refuses to coalesce into anything recognizable, yet distinctly is something. This isn't a trick of the eye, nor is it the product of an overactive imagination. When this photograph first came to light, it quickly circulated among those who specialize in historical imagery. Historians, renowned photo experts, archivists, they all examined it. They scrutinized it under magnification, digitally enhanced its faded tones, and meticulously cross-referenced it with countless other images from the same period. Their initial reactions were, as expected, attempts to rationalize, to categorize this strange element as a known photographic defect, perhaps a double exposure, a common issue with early cameras, or a flaw in the photographic plate, a chemical imperfection, a trick of the light, an odd reflection, a movement blur from the child shifting slightly during the long exposure. But one by one, each of these conventional explanations was discarded. The distortion simply didn't conform to any known photographic anomaly of the time. It wasn't a double exposure. The underlying elements didn't make sense. It wasn't a plate flaw. The disturbance was too localized, too intentional in its appearance. It wasn't a trick of the light. The shadows and highlights around it were consistent with the room's illumination, yet it remained dark, dense, inexplicable. And a movement blur? No, a blur has direction, a sense of motion. This was different. It was static yet fluid, present, yet absent. The experts, individuals whose careers are built on deciphering the visual records of the past, found themselves utterly stumped. They could not explain it away as a common defect, nor could they definitively identify what it was. The consensus, if it could be called that, was a chilling admission of ignorance. This object, this presence behind the young child in the 1903 photograph, simply should not be there. It defied their understanding of photography, of history, and perhaps of reality itself. This image, fading yet enduring, presents us with a profound mystery. It challenges our perceptions, forces us to question what we believe to be possible, and invites us to look beyond the surface of what history presents. What do you see? What form? What shadow? What impossible presence do you perceive lurking in the background of this century-old family portrait? We are about to embark on a journey deep into the story behind this unsettling image, to uncover its origins, the family it depicts, and the desperate attempts to understand the inexplicable. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the past, and about the thin veil that separates the ordinary from the truly extraordinary. The story of this enigmatic photograph begins, as many do, with a family. They were the Millers, a name as common and unassuming as the small town they inhabited, Willow Creek, nestled quietly in the verdant landscapes of upstate New York. Not a place of grand historical events or dramatic legends, Willow Creek was, and largely remains, a picture of rural American tranquility. The Millers were a seemingly ordinary family, a thread in the vast tapestry of turn-of-the-century life, indistinguishable from thousands of others. Their lives, like their neighbors, revolved around the rhythms of the seasons, the local church, and the simple, hard work that defined existence in that era. This particular photograph, the one that now holds such an unsettling secret, found its way into modern hands through Sarah Miller, a direct descendant. Sarah, a woman in her late 30s with a keen eye for history and a deep respect for her family's lineage, stumbled upon it while undertaking the bittersweet task of clearing out her grandmother's old house. It was a chore filled with nostalgia and discovery, a journey through decades of accumulated memories. The photo lay tucked away in a dusty wooden box, nestled among other faded pictures, brittle letters, and forgotten trinkets in the attic. A casual find initially, just another piece of the Miller family puzzle. The setting captured in the photograph, now examined with renewed scrutiny, reveals more details about the Millers' humble existence. It is a simple, somewhat sparse parlor or living room, characteristic of many homes in 1903. The furniture, heavy and dark-wooded, speaks of practicality and durability rather than extravagance. Perhaps a sturdy oak table, chairs with worn upholstery, or a tall, narrow bookshelf filled with well-read volumes. A potted plant, likely a fern or a similar hardy houseplant, sits on a small stand, adding a touch of domesticity. The wallpaper, if visible, would be a muted, faded pattern, perhaps floral or geometric, a silent witness to countless family gatherings, quiet evenings, and the passage of time. It's a scene utterly devoid of anything overtly dramatic or unusual, making the anomaly even more jarring in its context. The child in the photograph is young Thomas Miller, the focus of our unsettling mystery. From the sparse fragments of family lore that Sarah had gathered over the years, Thomas was known as a quiet boy. He was often described as being somewhat sickly, prone to fevers and unexplained ailments that, in an age before modern medicine, were simply accepted as part of childhood. He was the kind of child who kept to himself, whose inner world seemed richer than his external interactions. His quiet demeanor, previously attributed to his delicate health, now takes on a more ominous quality when viewed through the lens of the photograph's secret. Delving deeper into the Miller family history, Sarah had always encountered veiled references to certain darker, less talked-about chapters. These were the hushed whispers at family reunions. The stories quickly changed when a child entered the room. Unexplained misfortunes, odd behaviors, or sudden tragic events that were always conveniently dismissed as old wives' tales or the hardships of the past. They were the kind of narratives that, over generations, morph into vague superstitions, losing their sharp edges of truth but retaining a lingering sense of unease. Now, with the photograph in hand, these dismissed stories begin to resonate with a new, chilling significance. To truly appreciate the strangeness of the anomaly, it's crucial to understand the limitations and characteristics of photography in 1903. This was an era of large format cameras, glass plates, and rudimentary flash powder. Exposure times were considerably longer than today, often several seconds, sometimes even minutes, especially indoors. This meant that any movement from the subject would result in a blur. A child fidgeting, a breeze rustling curtains, an adult shifting slightly. All could leave ghostly trails or indistinct shapes. However, the anomaly in the Miller photograph simply does not fit this description. It's not a smear of motion. It has a distinct, though unidentifiable presence that seems to occupy a fixed space, almost as if it were posing or perhaps simply existing there, unperturbed by the laws of light and time. It doesn't look like a simple blur caused by movement. It looks like a thing. To further contextualize this, Sarah had meticulously gathered other photographs from the same era, even from the Miller family archives. There were portraits of stern-faced ancestors, candid shots of picnics by the creek, and formal studio sittings. In all these images, the typical photographic quirks of the time were evident: the occasional soft focus, the subtle vignetting, the telltale blurs from subjects unable to hold perfectly still. These provided a clear baseline, a visual dictionary of what a normal 1903 photograph should look like. And against this backdrop of ordinary historical imagery, the Miller photograph, with its inexplicable background presence, stood out not as an amateurish mistake, but as a profound, unsettling deviation from the norm. It highlighted that whatever was behind young Thomas was not a common photographic artifact. It was something else entirely. Sarah Miller, the descendant who unearthed this peculiar artifact, initially tried to dismiss the strange element in the photograph. Her rational mind, accustomed to the logical explanations of the modern world, told her it was merely an optical illusion, a trick of the light, or perhaps a smudge that had adhered to the century-old emulsion. She cleaned the photograph meticulously, gently wiping its surface with a soft cloth, half expecting the anomaly to vanish, to reveal itself as nothing more than dust or a minor imperfection. But it remained, stubbornly etched into the silver halides, a silent, unsettling witness from the past. Her initial reaction was one of mild confusion, then a growing fascination. What was that? She held the photograph at arm's length, then brought it close, tilting it under different light sources, hoping to catch some angle that would dissolve the mystery into a mundane explanation. But the more she scrutinized it, the more the unsettling feeling grew. It wasn't just a shadow. It had a vague, almost intentional form, a sense of presence that belied its indistinctness. Driven by this burgeoning unease, Sarah began to show the photograph to others. First, her close friends, then her more distant family members, people she trusted to offer an unbiased perspective. Their reactions were a spectrum, each one adding a layer to her growing conviction that this was no ordinary photograph. Some, ever the pragmatists, immediately offered mundane explanations. "Looks like a shadow from a curtain," one friend suggested, squinting at the image. "Probably just a defect from the old camera," another offered, shrugging it off. These were the dismissals, the attempts to rationalize the inexplicable, born perhaps from a discomfort with the unknown. But then there were the others, the ones whose eyes widened slightly, whose brows furrowed in confusion, and who instinctively recoiled, even subtly. "What is that behind Tommy?" her cousin asked, a tremor in her voice, echoing Sarah's own unspoken question. Another family member, usually unflappable, simply stared at it for a long moment, then handed it back with a look of profound unease, saying only, "That's not right." The collective unease, the shared sense of something being profoundly amiss, solidified Sarah's resolve. This wasn't her imagination. Others saw it too, Determined to get a clearer view, Sarah, with her background in digital media, attempted to digitally enhance the photograph. She scanned the fragile print at the highest possible resolution, then meticulously worked with various imaging software. She adjusted contrast, sharpened details, experimented with different filters, and even tried to isolate specific color channels, hoping to bring out hidden information. But the anomaly remained stubbornly unclear. It seemed to resist definition, almost as if it actively veiled itself from clarity. The more she tried to sharpen it, the more it seemed to dissolve into an even more ambiguous yet undeniably present form. It was a dark, amorphous shape, yet it occupied a specific space, a void that somehow contained a presence. It was frustratingly indefinable, a ghostly echo of something that shouldn't be there. Her next step was to reach out to local historical societies and photo archives. She frequented libraries, dug through microfiche records, and contacted regional experts, hoping to find similar occurrences in other turn-of-the-century photographs from the area, particularly from Willow Creek or surrounding towns in upstate New York. She spent countless hours poring over dusty collections, examining thousands of images from the same period, looking for any comparable anomaly, any photographic glitch that resembled what she saw in the Miller photo. She found nothing, not a single similar instance. Every other photograph, despite their age and the limitations of early photography, presented a clear, understandable visual record. The Miller photo remained an outlier, an isolated incident of the inexplicable. The more she looked, the more the unsettling feeling grew, not just about the photograph, but about the very fabric of her family's past. The comfortable narrative of the Millers as an ordinary, hard-working family began to fray at the edges. She started researching the Miller family history with a new intensity, moving beyond mere genealogical charts and birth dates. She sought out old letters, diaries, local newspaper archives, and even oral histories from distant relatives, looking for anything strange, anything that might shed light on the peculiar presence captured behind young Thomas. It was during this deeper dive that she began to uncover a pattern, a series of faint, almost whispered mentions of unsettling events. She found references to unexplained illnesses that seemed to plague certain family members, particularly children, often leading to sudden mysterious deaths that were vaguely attributed to consumption or childhood fevers, but with an underlying tone of something more sinister. There were mentions of strange occurrences within the Miller household, objects moving on their own, unexplained cold spots, whispers heard in empty rooms, and sudden, inexplicable bouts of terror experienced by family members. Even more chilling were the vague allusions to sudden disappearances in the family lineage, particularly around the time of the photograph. These incidents, scattered throughout generations, were always attributed to common diseases, accidents, or simply individuals moving away without a trace in an era of less communication. But now, seen through the lens of the photograph, they began to coalesce into a narrative of something more persistent, more malevolent. The Millers, she discovered, had a subtle, unspoken reputation in Willow Creek. It wasn't a reputation for scandal or criminality, but rather for being a bit odd. A family that kept to themselves, perhaps a little too much. A family that seemed to attract misfortune, or perhaps was simply prone to seeing things others didn't. This reputation, usually dismissed as small-town gossip or the natural consequence of being slightly reclusive, now took on a new, more ominous meaning. Was it possible that the oddness wasn't just a quirk of personality, but a reaction to something unseen, something that had haunted the Miller family for generations? The photograph, with its silent, dark witness, suggested that this wasn't just a family quirk, but a deep-seated, generational burden, frozen in time for all to see, if only they dared to look closely enough. The unsettling revelations from her deep dive into the Miller family history, coupled with the stubborn inexplicability of the photograph, finally pushed Sarah to seek external expertise. She understood that her own emotional investment and lack of specialized knowledge might be clouding her judgment. Thus, she embarked on a new phase of her investigation, reaching out to professional historians, and in a move that felt both desperate and necessary, even a handful of paranormal investigators. She cast a wide net, hoping that someone, anyone, could provide a definitive answer, or at least a credible theory, for the anomaly that had consumed her thoughts. The initial reactions from these experts were, predictably, steeped in skepticism. Historians, trained to meticulously analyze primary sources and ground their conclusions in tangible evidence, offered explanations rooted in the technical limitations of early photography. "It's pareidolia," one seasoned archivist suggested over the phone, his voice tinged with polite dismissal, referring to the psychological phenomenon where the mind perceives a familiar pattern where none actually exists. "A double exposure, perhaps," another posited, theorizing that the photographic plate might have been exposed twice, creating an accidental superposition of images. A photography restorer, after a cursory glance at the high-resolution scan, confidently declared it a smudge on the plate common in that era. These were the rational, scientific explanations, the comfortable narratives that allowed them to categorize and dismiss the anomaly as a known photographic defect. However, as Sarah persisted, providing more context, more detail about the Miller family's strange history, and insisting on a closer examination, these experts slowly began to change their tune. When confronted with the actual physical photograph or meticulously detailed digital reconstructions, their initial certainty wavered. The smudge didn't behave like a smudge. It had an internal coherence, however vague. The double exposure theory struggled to explain why only this particular area of the background was affected, and why it didn't blend in a way consistent with two distinct images overlapping. The more they scrutinized, the less their conventional explanations held up. They couldn't definitively explain it away, not with the scientific rigor they prided themselves on. A quiet sense of perplexity began to replace their initial skepticism. It was at this critical juncture that Dr. Evelyn Reed entered the picture. Dr. Reed was a renowned photo historian from Boston University, a figure of considerable authority in her field, known for her rigorous scientific approach and her unwavering commitment to empirical evidence. She was not easily swayed by conjecture or sensationalism, and her reputation was built on debunking myths rather than propagating them. Sarah, after numerous rejections, finally managed to secure a meeting with Dr. Reed, presenting her with the photograph and the mounting pile of research she had amassed. Dr. Reed, initially cautious, agreed to take on the case, intrigued by Sarah's thoroughness and the sheer persistence of the anomaly. She approached the photograph with the precision of a surgeon, employing a battery of advanced imaging techniques. She utilized spectral analysis to examine the chemical composition of the photographic emulsion, hoping to identify foreign substances or anomalies in the silver halide crystals. She subjected the image to multispectral imaging, capturing data outside the normal visible light range to reveal details that might be invisible to the naked eye. She even went as far as attempting to recreate the conditions of the 1903 photo shoot in a controlled environment, meticulously replicating the lighting, camera type, and even the approximate exposure times, all in an effort to understand if the anomaly could be replicated under normal circumstances. The more Dr. Reed investigated, the more perplexed she became. Her cutting-edge equipment and scientific methodology, usually so adept at dissecting and explaining photographic phenomena, met an unusual resistance. The anomaly in the Miller photograph had a consistent, almost deliberate presence. It wasn't random. It occupied a specific spatial relation to young Thomas, almost as if it were intentionally positioned behind him. It refused to yield to any known photographic explanation. It wasn't a defect, not a blur, not a smudge, not a reflection. It was there. As Dr. Reed delved deeper, she began to articulate the thing in the background with slightly more detail, even if still vague. It was consistently described as a dark shape, a void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was something about its geometry that felt unnatural, an outline that hinted at a form but defied conventional recognition. It wasn't human, Certainly not in any recognizable way, but it also wasn't animal. There were hints of elongated limbs or perhaps tendrils that seemed to stretch out, almost reaching towards the child. It lacked the distinct features of a person, yet possessed an undeniable, unsettling silhouette, a presence that felt both ethereal and disturbingly solid. It was a shape that seemed to exist on the very edge of perception, always almost there, but never fully revealing itself. While Dr. Reed pursued her scientific investigations, Sarah found herself experiencing strange occurrences around her own house, occurrences that began subtly and escalated in frequency and intensity, particularly after she brought the original photograph home from Dr. Reed's lab for safekeeping. Flickering lights even when the wiring had been recently checked, unexplained cold spots that would suddenly manifest in various rooms, sending shivers down her spine, only to dissipate moments later. And then there were the whispers, faint, indistinct murmurs that she couldn't quite make out, seeming to emanate from empty corners or just beyond the threshold of hearing. At first, Sarah, ever the rationalist, dismissed them. Faulty wiring, old house creaks, the power of suggestion. But as they continued, a cold dread began to creep in, a chilling realization that perhaps her deep dive into the Miller family's past had opened a door she might not be able to close. The photograph, seemingly a mere image, felt increasingly like a conduit, a bridge connecting her present to a past that refused to stay buried. Dr. Reed, with her methodical approach, wasn't content with just analyzing the photograph. She understood that context was paramount, and the Miller family archives, though seemingly mundane, held the promise of deeper truths. It was during her meticulous sifting through boxes of dusty documents, forgotten letters, and brittle ledgers that she stumbled upon something truly significant. A collection of old letters and, more importantly, a leather-bound diary belonging to Thomas Miller's mother, Eleanor. The diary, its pages yellowed with age and its ink faded in places, promised a direct, unfiltered glimpse into the family's life around 1903. As Dr. Reed carefully turned the fragile pages, she found that Eleanor's entries from around the time the photograph was taken became increasingly frantic, their tone shifting from the mundane details of household management and social calls to a palpable sense of fear and desperation. Eleanor wrote about the presence, a vague but terrifying entity that seemed to have taken root within their home. She spoke of the shadow that watches Tommy, a chilling phrase that immediately connected to the indistinct shape in the photograph. Her growing fear was almost tangible on the page, the hurried strokes of her pen conveying a mind under immense strain. Eleanor's entries detailed increasingly disturbing observations about young Thomas. She mentioned strange symbols that the 5-year-old would draw repeatedly on scraps of paper, on the dusty floorboards, and even once, with a stick in the garden soil. These weren't childish doodles. Eleanor described them as complex, repetitive patterns that seemed to hold a disturbing significance. Even more unsettling was Thomas's habit of talking to someone no one else could see. He would often be found in his room, or even in the parlor where the photograph was taken, seemingly engaged in quiet conversation with an invisible companion. Eleanor wrote of her attempts to question him, but Thomas would only grow silent, his eyes wide, as if fearing retribution from his unseen friend. Then, Dr. Reed found an entry that sent a shiver down her spine, dated just days after the family photograph was taken. Eleanor described a specific, terrifying incident. She had woken in the dead of night to a sense of profound cold and an unnatural silence. Peering into Thomas's crib, she saw it. A dark figure, tall and gaunt, standing silently over her sleeping son. Eleanor screamed, a primal sound of terror that jolted her husband Isaac awake. By the time Isaac reached the nursery, the figure had vanished, leaving behind only the lingering cold and Eleanor's trembling, hysterical sobs. She described the figure with chilling precision, its height, its shadowy form, the way it seemed to absorb the faint moonlight filtering through the window. This wasn't a dream, she asserted. It was real, and it was watching her son. The diary continued to chronicle Eleanor's desperate attempts to make sense of what was happening. She described how she tried to warn her husband, Isaac, about the presence, about the dark figure, about Thomas's strange behavior. But Isaac, a man of his time, steeped in pragmatism and a staunch disbelief in anything beyond the tangible, dismissed her fears as nerves. He attributed her growing anxiety to the stresses of motherhood and the isolated life in Willow Creek, or worse, to superstitious nonsense gleaned from local folklore. He urged her to rest, to pray, to focus on her duties, effectively silencing her increasingly desperate pleas for help. The entries painted a poignant picture of a woman isolated in her terror, trying to protect her child from an unseen threat, while her own husband refused to acknowledge its existence. The turning point for Dr. Reed, and by extension for Sarah, was the chilling realization that the Miller family, or at least Eleanor, knew something was profoundly wrong. This wasn't an accidental capture of a random anomaly. It was a snapshot of a family under siege, a moment where a terrifying truth was inadvertently exposed. The photograph wasn't just an anomaly, it was a captured moment of a terrifying, suppressed reality. It became clear that the family's dismissive attitude towards Eleanor's fears, particularly Isaac's refusal to believe her, had created an environment where the entity could thrive, unchallenged and unseen by all but the most vulnerable and perceptive. As Sarah absorbed Dr. Reed's findings from Eleanor's diary, a cold dread began to settle deep within her. The flickering lights, the cold spots, the whispers, her own recent unsettling experiences around her house after spending so much time with the photograph, suddenly clicked into place. They were no longer random occurrences, easily dismissed as the quirks of an old house or an overactive imagination. They mirrored Eleanor's descriptions of strange phenomena. The whispers, which she couldn't quite decipher, now felt like echoes of Thomas's unseen conversations. The cold spots were reminiscent of the chilling presence Eleanor had felt. A horrifying realization dawned upon Sarah. She might not just be dealing with a historical curiosity, a puzzle from the past. She might be dealing with something far more immediate, something that had clung to the photograph, or perhaps had been reawakened by her intense focus on it. The diary entries, particularly Eleanor's desperate pleas and her husband's dismissive reactions, painted a picture of a family struggling against an invisible force, a struggle that was tragically lost due to disbelief and denial. The photograph, far from being just a historical artifact, now felt like a living document, a conduit to a past horror that was beginning to bleed into her present. The anomaly behind Thomas was not a mere photographic error. It was a captured entity, a silent witness to a family's unspoken terror. And now, it felt like that terror was reaching out, across more than a century, to touch her own life. The line between history and haunting had blurred, and Sarah found herself standing squarely in the middle of it. The chilling realization that the entity captured in the 1903 photograph might not be a relic of the past, but an active, potentially malevolent presence, shifted the entire focus of Sarah's and Dr. Reed's investigation. The question was no longer merely what it was, but what it wanted, and what it had wanted with young Thomas. Was it benevolent, a silent guardian, or something far more sinister? A parasitic entity that fed on fear or attachment? Eleanor's diary entries, filled with dread and the palpable sense of a mother's helplessness, strongly suggested the latter. Their research took a new, more urgent turn, delving beyond standard historical archives into the rich, often unsettling tapestry of local folklore surrounding Willow Creek. They scoured old town records, interviewed elderly residents who still remembered tales passed down through generations, and consulted obscure regional histories. What they unearthed was a pattern of stories, whispered across hearths and campfires for centuries, about shadow folk or thin men. These were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but entities described as gaunt, often tall figures, existing on the periphery of human perception. The legends consistently depicted them as beings that would follow certain families, particularly those with a history of neglecting old ways, breaking ancient taboos, or disrespecting the natural order. Some tales spoke of families who had grown too proud, too disconnected from the land, or who had, perhaps inadvertently, angered an ancient spirit of the woods. Invariably, these entities would latch on to the youngest or most vulnerable child in the cursed lineage, subtly influencing them, draining their vitality, or simply observing them with an unnerving, patient malevolence. One specific local legend resonated with particular force. It spoke of a prosperous family in the early 18th century who, in their relentless pursuit of progress and wealth, had cut down a sacred grove of ancient oaks, a place revered by the indigenous peoples and local settlers alike. The legend claimed that an ancient spirit, the guardian of that grove, had been gravely angered. It did not seek direct vengeance on the parents, but instead latched onto their youngest child, a sickly boy who soon began to waste away, speaking to invisible companions and drawing strange symbols. The boy eventually vanished without a trace, and the family line, though it continued, was forever marked by misfortune and unexplained losses. The parallels to young Thomas Miller, his frail health, his unseen companions, and the family's own history of unexplained tragedies, were too stark to ignore. It was during a meticulous re-examination of the photograph itself, no longer just the image but the physical artifact, that Sarah and Dr. Reed made another crucial discovery. Dr. Reed, with her practiced eye for detail, had noticed a slight irregularity in the backing of the antique wooden frame. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, hidden beneath layers of old, brittle paper that had been pasted over the original backing to protect it. Carefully, with the delicate tools of a conservator, she began to peel away the layers. Beneath them, carved directly into the aged wood of the frame, was a strange, almost ritualistic symbol. It was intricate, composed of interlocking lines and geometric shapes, unlike anything they had seen in the Miller family's conventional documents. The moment Sarah saw it, a jolt of recognition went through her. It matched a symbol described in Eleanor's diary, one of the strange, complex symbols young Thomas would incessantly draw. Eleanor had sketched it crudely in her journal, trying to replicate her son's disturbing artistry, writing next to it, "Tommy's mark. He draws it everywhere. Says it keeps the bad shadows away." This symbol became a new focal point. Sarah immediately contacted a local cultural anthropologist, Dr. Elena Petrova, who specialized in regional folklore and ancient protective practices. Dr. Petrova, after carefully studying the symbol, confirmed its significance. It was indeed an old protective sigil, but not one commonly used for general warding. Its specific configuration, she explained, indicated a very particular purpose. It was meant to contain or repel something that was already present, an entity that had already breached the veil. It was a sigil of containment, a desperate measure taken when an unwanted presence had already established itself. It wasn't preventative, it was reactive. The implication was chilling. The Miller family, or at least Eleanor, had known. They had been aware of the entity's presence, and they had been actively trying to protect Thomas from something that was already attached to him. The photograph, therefore, wasn't just an accidental capture of a fleeting anomaly. It was a frozen moment in an ongoing, desperate struggle. The thing in the background wasn't just observing. It was there, a tangible, albeit indistinct, presence. The symbol on the frame, hidden away yet directly connected to Thomas's drawings, suggested a child's instinctive attempt at self-preservation, perhaps guided by the very entity he sought to repel, or by some latent ancestral knowledge. The narrative began to coalesce into a deeply unsettling picture. The Miller family, perhaps unknowingly, had inherited a burden, a connection to an ancient, malevolent force. Eleanor, with her heightened maternal instincts and perhaps a more open mind than her pragmatic husband, had perceived the threat. Young Thomas, innocent and vulnerable, had become the focal point of this entity's attention. The photograph, far from being a simple family portrait, was a literal snapshot of a child under siege, with the dark, indistinct presence looming just behind him, almost a shadow of his own being. The thing wasn't merely a photographic error or a trick of the light. It was an active participant in the scene, its presence acknowledged and feared by at least one member of the family, and perhaps instinctively understood by the child himself. The protective sigil on the frame, Thomas's drawings, Eleanor's frantic diary entries, all pointed to a family desperately trying to ward off an encroaching darkness that had found its way into their home and into the life of their youngest. The historical mystery had transformed into a chilling testament to an unseen battle, captured for eternity in a single sepia-toned image. The accumulated evidence, meticulously gathered and painstakingly analyzed, now converged towards a single terrifying conclusion. The diary entries of Eleanor Miller, the harrowing local legends of shadow folk and thin men, the strange occurrences experienced by Sarah Miller herself, and the unsettling image captured in the 1903 photograph. All these disparate threads wove together into a tapestry of undeniable supernatural dread. However, one final crucial piece of evidence remained elusive, a missing link that would transform conjecture into chilling certainty. Dr. Reed, driven by an almost obsessive need for definitive answers, returned to the archives, this time focusing not just on documents but on the material culture of the Miller family. She scoured inventories, wills, and even old newspaper advertisements for the Miller household, hoping to find mention of any forgotten heirlooms, any object that might have been overlooked. Her persistence finally paid off when she discovered a faded, handwritten note tucked inside an old family Bible. It was a brief, almost cryptic message from Eleanor's sister, Martha, dated just a few years after the photograph was taken. The note spoke of a locket that Eleanor had always worn, a charm for protection that she had given to young Thomas shortly before his unexplained disappearance. Martha urged her brother-in-law, Isaac, to keep it safe for Tommy's sake, but there was no further mention of the locket in any subsequent family records. This revelation spurred a frantic search. Sarah, recalling old family stories, remembered her grandmother mentioning a small, ornate locket that had been passed down through the generations, often dismissed as a trinket of little value, eventually relegated to a dusty box of forgotten jewelry. It had been in her possession for years, a small silver filigree piece unexamined and largely ignored. Now, with trembling hands, she retrieved it. It was cold to the touch and surprisingly heavy for its size. Under Dr. Reed's careful examination, the locket revealed its secrets. It was indeed the protective charm mentioned by Martha. Etched faintly on its polished surface, almost worn away by time and handling, was a symbol. It was the very same intricate sigil that Thomas had drawn, the same one carved into the back of the photograph's frame. This was undeniable proof, a physical manifestation of the family's desperate attempts at warding off the encroaching entity. The locket, presumably placed around Thomas's neck by his terrified mother, represented a last-ditch effort to shield him. But the most profound revelation came from the photograph itself. Dr. Reed, armed with the knowledge gleaned from Eleanor's diary, the local legends, and the locket's symbol, decided to push the limits of modern photographic analysis. She utilized cutting-edge spectral imaging techniques, far beyond what was available even a few years prior, to re-examine the original glass plate negative of the 1903 photograph. The negative, remarkably preserved, held more information than the printed sepia copy. As the sophisticated software processed the image, enhancing minute tonal variations and bringing out details imperceptible to the human eye, the thing behind Thomas began to resolve with terrifying clarity. It was no longer just a shadow, or a blur, or a distortion caused by a long exposure. The faint, unsettling features that had previously been hinted at now coalesced into a distinct, horrifying form. What emerged from the digital haze sent a shiver down the spines of both Sarah and Dr. Reed. The entity possessed elongated, impossibly thin limbs, disproportionate to any known human or animal anatomy. Its posture was not merely hunched or indistinct, it was anatomically impossible, a contortion that defied the natural laws of skeletal structure. The most terrifying detail, however, was its head. It was elongated, almost skeletal, with hollowed-out spaces where eyes should have been. These eyes seemed to absorb all light, reflecting nothing, giving the impression of infinite depth and cold malevolence. There was no mouth, no nose, just a smooth, unnerving expanse of dark, almost leathery skin, stretched taut over what appeared to be a bony framework. It was something truly other, a being that seemed to exist outside the natural order of the world. Its form was not solid, yet it was undeniably present, a spectral predator caught in the act of observing its prey. The historians, initially skeptical and grounded in scientific rationalism, were forced to a conclusion that defied all conventional understanding. The photograph was not a trick of light, a defect, or a misinterpretation. It was a genuine capture of an unknown entity, a spectral presence that was actively disturbing the Miller family. The unexplained part was no longer just about the image's ambiguity, but about what it definitively depicted. They could now confirm its presence, its horrifying form, but its nature, its origin, its purpose. These remained shrouded in an impenetrable mystery. The final revelation left Sarah and Dr. Reed with more questions than answers, emphasizing the enduring, terrifying mystery. The Miller family photo was not merely a window into a past horror. It was a testament to an unseen world, a stark reminder that some things exist beyond our comprehension, patiently waiting in the shadows. The entity, now revealed in its ghastly detail, was a silent, chilling companion to young Thomas, a predator frozen in time, forever looming behind him. The very air around the photograph, now digitally enhanced and undeniably clear, seemed to hum with a residual, ancient malevolence. The historical context, the desperate efforts of Eleanor, the child's silent struggle, all converged on this single, horrifying image, confirming that the Miller family had indeed been haunted, and that the camera, in its impartial gaze, had captured a truth too terrifying for words. The photo was not just an artifact, it was a warning, a chilling glimpse into a reality that most instinctively refused to acknowledge. The profound impact of the 1903 photograph, now stripped of its ambiguity and revealing an undeniable, monstrous presence, reverberated deeply within both Sarah Miller and Dr. Evelyn Reed. For Sarah, it was a terrifying validation of generations of whispered family fears, transforming vague anxieties into a concrete, visual horror. It had irrevocably altered her understanding of her own lineage, painting a darker, more complex history than she had ever imagined. The sense of an inherited burden, once a distant abstract notion, now felt chillingly palpable. The strange occurrences she had experienced around her home, the flickering lights and the inexplicable cold spots, no longer felt like products of an overactive imagination, but rather lingering echoes, perhaps even residual manifestations, of the entity's continued influence. It had changed her perception of reality, forcing her to confront the unsettling truth that some forces operate beyond the comfortable boundaries of scientific explanation. For Dr. Reed, a woman whose career was built on the bedrock of empirical evidence and rational analysis, the photograph became a monumental turning point. It challenged every academic principle she held dear, pushing the boundaries of historical inquiry into realms previously dismissed as superstition. The undeniable visual evidence, meticulously extracted from the old negative, shattered her scientific skepticism, leaving in its place a profound sense of awe and unease. Her understanding of history, once a neatly categorized sequence of events, now felt porous, susceptible to unseen influences and hidden truths. The photograph wasn't just an academic curiosity, it was a testament to the limitations of human knowledge, a stark reminder that the world held mysteries far grander and far more terrifying than she had ever conceived. It had redefined her professional purpose, shifting her focus from merely documenting the past to grappling with its inexplicable, enduring shadows. Their research, though it had yielded such a terrifying revelation, was far from over. The identity and the ultimate purpose of the entity remained shrouded in mystery. They knew what it looked like, and they knew it had terrorized the Miller family. But the why and the from where continued to elude them. Dr. Reed, now driven by a new kind of academic urgency, began to compile all the findings into a comprehensive report, not for traditional publication, but for a select small group of trusted colleagues who specialized in anomalous phenomena and fringe histories. She meticulously documented the spectral analysis, the historical context, Eleanor's diary entries, the local folklore, and the definitive visual enhancement of the entity. The aim was no longer to debunk, but to understand, to categorize the unknown. Sarah, meanwhile, continued to delve into her family archives, searching for any further clues, any forgotten letter or object that might shed more light on the entity's origins or its eventual fate. The locket, now understood as a desperate attempt at protection, remained a tangible link to Thomas's last known moments. The existence of this photograph, with its undeniable depiction of an unknown entity, raised profound philosophical questions. What did this mean for other old photographs tucked away in dusty attics and forgotten albums? How many other families, unknowingly, might possess similar captured moments of the inexplicable? Were there countless other such images hidden away, dismissed as photographic defects or tricks of the light, simply because no one had the tools or the courage to look deeper? The implication was unsettling. History might be littered with silent witnesses to the supernatural, waiting to be rediscovered and understood. The Miller family photo suggested a hidden layer of reality, a veil that occasionally thinned, allowing glimpses of what lay beyond. As the enhanced image of the entity was displayed one last time, its elongated limbs and light-absorbing eyes now chillingly clear, the profound, unsettling nature of the photograph truly sunk in. It was no longer a vague shadow, but a distinct, malevolent presence, forever linked to the innocent child in the foreground. The contrast between Thomas's vulnerable, slightly uncomfortable pose and the terrifying form looming behind him was a stark illustration of an unseen struggle, a battle waged in the quiet confines of a 1903 parlor. The image wasn't just a historical artifact, it was a testament to a world beyond human comprehension, a world where the line between the real and the unreal blurred into a terrifying, undeniable truth. The Miller family photo from 1903 isn't just a glimpse into the past. It's a stark reminder that some things, even now, simply cannot be explained. It stands as a chilling testament to the enduring power of the unknown, a silent scream frozen in time. And perhaps, some things are better left undisturbed. The desire for knowledge, for understanding, can sometimes lead down paths that reveal truths too unsettling to fully comprehend. Truths that challenge the very fabric of our perceived reality. This photograph, a seemingly innocuous family portrait, became a portal to a forgotten horror, a permanent record of a haunting that transcended generations. It serves as a final, unnerving question mark in the annals of history, a silent guardian of a terrifying secret. The story of the Miller family, and the entity that clung to them, will continue to echo, a chilling whisper from the past, forever captured in a single sepia-toned frame. It compels us to look closer, to question what we think we know, and to acknowledge that some mysteries, like the shadow behind young Thomas, may never truly be solved, only recognized for their terrifying existence.